Well, I had a chance meeting with a gentleman on an airplane the spring of my senior year in college. I was exhausted and not really interested in a conversation, but he was a lively, elderly gentleman who got me talking. And I was, at the time, reading my grandfather's mystery novel, newly released mystery novel that he wrote about his mother, Eleanor Roosevelt, completely fictional. And I had that on my lap. And so he started talking about Elliott Roosevelt. And he found out that he was my grandfather. And he became even more engaged. And he couldn't have been cuter. And his eyes just lit up as he started to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. And he said that as a young man, he had read her daily column throughout his lifetime. That was a syndicated column in the newspaper. And then I started asking him questions because this was news to me. I was a science major in college, and I had not studied history, and I did not know much about my grandparents or great-grandparents other than personal stories that I had heard. So he started educating me about Eleanor Roosevelt's contributions through her column that he had read. And so I was fascinated, and he, I think, could sense that. And he said, "You know, young lady, this has kind of piqued my interest again. I would love you," we didn't have email back then, but he gave me his address, and he said, "I would love you to find a volume of these columns and then send me the name of the book, and I'm going to go purchase it." And so as soon as I got off the airplane, I asked my dad about that, and he said, "Oh yeah, Grandmere used to write these daily columns," and he started talking about it. So my interest was piqued, and I learned that no one had done anything with her columns at the time. They were still in the archives of the Roosevelt Library, and so the timing was right, and I showed up 2 months later after I graduated, or maybe it was 3 months later, at the Roosevelt Library and read every single one of her daily columns chronologically. So that was fascinating to me. And through that several month period, I just kind of, where I really had not known much about my great-grandmother before, felt that I was kind of absorbing a sense of her philosophy of life. And she got me, she hooked me. And I became so inspired by her life that at that point I decided I would try to keep her legacy alive. And I initially started out doing exactly what Rabbi Platt had asked me to do. I wanted to chronicle and catalog her columns in a volume. It took me a few years, though. I had to get a full-time job, and I had a few babies in there. So before I knew it, the internet came on the horizon, and with the advent of the internet, all of the historical writings, as you know, are so much more accessible, which is an amazing thing. So I don't have to get that volume out. They're all on the internet. So I just enjoy keeping her legacy alive now through talks like these to various groups of all different ages. Eleanor began writing her newspaper column in 1936 at the end of FDR's first term in office and continued almost until the time of her death in 1962. The column was syndicated and was carried worldwide by most of the major newspapers. And I don't know if you've read it, but it was nothing fancy. In it, Eleanor simply described the events of her previous day and made comments about them. It was unique, however, because it provided the public the opportunity to follow this incredibly active woman around the globe. She was not only FDR's eyes and ears, but with this column, she became the eyes and ears of the country. Oh, here it is. I'm going to switch the slides. As First Lady, Eleanor traveled America studying the New Deal programs, trying to figure out which were working and which were not, and she reported to the president and to her readers what she felt the American people were thinking and feeling. She was incredibly active, traveling as many as 200 days a year. On one of her trips to Israel, in fact, this is such a funny story, she became so engrossed in the culture that she bought her granddaughter who was traveling with her a camel. Practicality eventually did set in when she learned of the strict American import laws, and she agreed to leave the camel behind in the Jerusalem Zoo, much to Nina's chagrin. Now, Eleanor's travels and activity did not stop in 1945 when FDR died, as everyone suspected they would. In fact, once Eleanor was no longer in the White House, she was able to let down her protective guard and delve into issues that particularly interested and excited her and speak more freely about them. It was at this point, I think, that the columns became much more interesting because they became much more expressive and revealing of her own beliefs. In 1945, Eleanor wrote, "Of one thing I am sure. In order to be useful, we must stand for the things we feel are right, and we must work for those things wherever we find ourselves. It does very little good to believe in something unless you tell your friends and associates of your beliefs." So Eleanor took her role as journalist very seriously, and her My Day column became a tool for her to not only discuss political and social issues, but to quote, in her words, "challenge Republicans, complacent Democrats, timid liberals, and apathetic Americans to accept the responsibilities of living in a democracy." Now, as I read Eleanor's My Day column, I was struck by two attributes which emerged in every aspect of Eleanor's life. And these were her positive attitude and persistence in the face of adversity and her inner strength and discipline. Eleanor was an emotional orphan. She was a woman who experienced a childhood of economic privilege, but little else in the way of consistent or reliable love. Her mother, Anna Rebecca Hall, was a beautiful and pampered lady who, according to Eleanor's own account, was openly disappointed with her only daughter's homeliness and lack of a pretty face. She once told Eleanor, "You have no looks, so see to it you have manners." And although Eleanor's father truly adored her, he was an alcoholic and was simply unable to give his daughter the dependable love she desired. One of the saddest stories of this fragile relationship was when one afternoon, Elliott took Eleanor and three of his fox terriers on a walk through New York and ended up at the Knickerbocker Club, where he checked his dogs and Eleanor in at the coat check. The quick drink turned into a 6-hour stint, after which he left the club, forgetting his daughter, and Eleanor waited the entire time, knowing and hoping that her father would return for her. But when he failed to return after 6 hours, the doorman finally took Eleanor and the dogs home. And when she spoke of the incident in later years, she often added the terrible detail that she saw her father carried out of the club, and this was an image that never left her. Both of Eleanor's parents died by her 10th birthday, within 2 years of each other by her 10th birthday, leaving her to be raised by a very strict grandmother in a rigid setting. In 1945, Eleanor remarked in one of her columns, "It is many a long day that my grandmother used to suggest that I should make up my mind to be a better girl, not to steal candy from the pantry, and to take my cold bath in the morning instead of trying to get away with a warm one." So, as you can see, Eleanor had some painful memories of her childhood, and her early existence was clearly lonely and disappointing. She did have a fairly happy second decade, however, thanks to her French finishing school instructor, Madame Souvestre. Eleanor was sent away to a French finishing school in England and was introduced to a warm-hearted and loving woman, although I don't think that this picture shows that, who truly was interested in her and gave her the attention she had never before received. And the two shared a very rich and satisfying friendship for these 4 years. And for the first time, Eleanor, through her relationship with Madame Souvestre, began to build confidence in herself and in her abilities. And it was at this time, I think, that the idea blossomed in Eleanor's mind that a woman's life could be something larger than the debutante parties that so preoccupied the lives of her peers and were imminent upon her return to the United States. So fired up with a new commitment to social service, Eleanor returned to New York City and became entrenched in work in settlement houses in the city. And she said that this was the first time she found a real role for herself in society. And she applied herself to this work with great diligence and great enjoyment. Soon after she returned to New York, however, she married her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And unfortunately, her deeply satisfying work in social service had to end at this point because at that time it was not considered proper for a woman to work outside of the home. And beyond that, the young couple had 6 children in quick succession, one of whom died in infancy. And at that time, Eleanor was just staying at home, and she was not able to work outside of the house. Although Eleanor worked really hard at being a good mother, it was a role that proved painfully difficult for her, as she had never before had a good mothering role model in her own life. Additionally, from the day Eleanor and Franklin were married, Eleanor always came second to FDR's mother, Sarah, who played a very domineering role in their marriage. As a wedding gift, as a matter of fact, Sarah gave her son and daughter-in-law a brownstone in New York City. And while this is a very nice gift, this is a current picture of it, Sarah had neighboring brownstones built for herself and for Eleanor and Franklin, with connecting doors to the 2 homes at each level. So at any given time, she could pop in for a quick visit. And when they had dinner as a family in the evenings, Franklin would sit at one head of the table, Sarah would sit at the other head of the table, and Eleanor would be mixed in somewhere with the other kids. In addition to taking the back seat to her mother-in-law, Eleanor was betrayed early in her marriage when she discovered that FDR was having an affair with Lucy Mercer, who was Eleanor's own social secretary at the time. She wrote 25 years later, "The bottom dropped out of my own particular world at that point, and I faced myself, my surroundings, and my world honestly for the first time." So in a nutshell, you can see that Eleanor's life started out very lonely, with the exception of Madame Souvestre. She successively felt unloved, unimportant, and then betrayed. I love this picture. It could have ended here for Eleanor. She could have just become a dutiful and somber wife, but Eleanor refused to become a victim of her lonely childhood and a disappointing marriage. Instead, she focused all of her energy on others who were less fortunate than she, and she realized at the point when she discovered FDR's affair that she had to go outside of her marriage to find fulfillment. So through a constant involvement in charitable activities outside of herself and most importantly, outside of the house and most importantly, outside of herself, she began to build confidence. And this confidence slowly built upon itself, and before she knew it, she possessed a whole host of talents she never believed she could have. In her own words, she said, "About the only value the story of my life may hold is to show that one can, even without any particular gifts, overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable, and that in spite of timidity and fear, one can find a way to live widely and fully." She did overcome insurmountable obstacles, and she's the greatest example I know of someone who could overlook her own feelings of personal inadequacy and focus totally on others. She put such little importance on her own feelings of comfort and happiness and focused entirely on making others feel more comfortable, more productive, happier. And she really felt that this was the key to life, looking outside of yourself, the key to life, the key to personal happiness, and ultimately the key to making our democracy and international relations work. She had a gift of simplifying global problems and bringing them into the everyday lives and homes, the private lives and homes of everyday citizens. She made everyone, no matter who they were, feel that they could make a difference and that they should strive to do so. I want to read from 2 columns which I think demonstrate this philosophy very clearly. The first was written in 1954, and the second 4.5 years later in 1959. It seems to me that our best instrument internationally for bringing people together is found in the United Nations, and I hope and pray that we may strengthen that organization and allow it to do the best possible work for keeping peace. Without a forum of this kind and a meeting place for representatives of the people, it is difficult to imagine how greater understanding among people can be developed in a world kept at peace. I am convinced, however, that one of the essential steps that must be taken throughout the world is for individuals to try to set their own houses in order, to get rid of feelings of hate, and to try to develop charity and understanding in the circles that they individually touch. And in 1959, she said, "Let us wish this New Year's Day that the opportunity to live a richer, fuller life will be developed through international understanding and international effort. And let us remember that international achievement depends on individual achievement. That what we achieve in our own minds and hearts and in our surroundings will spread out like the ripples when we throw a pebble into an unruffled pool. So no one can say that what happens to an individual is unimportant, for no one knows how some individual act may ripple out even into international channels. May we learn everywhere in our country this coming year what it means to believe in the Christian religion. Christ never threw the first stone at human beings to make life more difficult for them. He never said that any one of us had more value than the other. He recognized that there were differences in opportunity for learning, but he showed us that it is what we are as human beings and what we do with these opportunities that really matters, not the mere fact that we have these opportunities. As I read the story of Christ, I think he was often too busy to notice the externals about people. This was true because he was so concerned about what people were really like inside, and he had the power of insight, sometimes denied us, but which I believe if we try hard enough to develop will be granted us. May this new year bring to all of us happiness, health, peace on earth, and peace in our hearts. And may all of us be granted the opportunity to work both for our own interests and achievements and for the achievements of those whom we love. Eleanor Roosevelt once said she had only three assets. She was keenly interested, she accepted great challenge and opportunity to learn more, and she had great energy and discipline. If I learned anything in my research, I learned that she was indeed these three things, but I might add that additionally, she kept herself so busy and simply thrived on work. She was a workhorse. In reliving the period of her life that I did, and in reading 27 years of her columns, I was exhausted. Her schedule, her contacts with people, and her correspondences were unending. She simply never rested. And even on her weekends and so-called vacations, she was busy entertaining dignitaries, leaders, youth, the needy, the poor, and so many family members. And if she was ever alone, which was very infrequently, she busied herself by corresponding with family, friends, and thousands of everyday citizens. I've been told by the library that she replied to every letter that she ever received, which is quite a feat. Her stamina was amazing. When you think, as Tom said, what it would take to write a daily column, day after day after day, week after week after week for 27 years, that alone shows great discipline. But the column was usually an afterthought in her day. It was often written on her lap in a train, in an airport between flights, or at her desk well after midnight. My mom and dad, and my mom's here too, were married in January of 1959 and spent part of their honeymoon with Eleanor Roosevelt in her apartment in New York City. And Eleanor's apartment, she lived at the Park Sheraton Hotel, which was on Central Park West, and she occupied part of the 14th floor. And the apartment was built in a U-shape around a central courtyard. And the room in which Mom and Dad were staying in was directly across the courtyard from Eleanor's study. So they said that on each of the nights that they would come in quite late after having been at the theater and dinner, they would always see Eleanor seated at her desk, writing letters by hand, corresponding with friends, or tending to other paperwork or writing her column. She rarely went to bed before 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and she always expected her overnight guest to meet her for breakfast the next morning at 7. And Mom said that she would always arrive at 7 dressed and ready for the day. And while her sleep at night was somewhat short, she possessed an unusual ability to catnap almost anywhere and under almost any conditions. My grandfather Elliott, as you know, was a pilot in World War II, and he flew his own small twin-engine plane in the 1950s after having flown in the war, and he would on occasion pick up his mother in the Denver airport and fly her up to their ranch, which was located in the northwestern part of the state. And the trip took them across the flat-top mountain range and was apparently usually very bumpy and quite harrowing. But upon takeoff, Eleanor would apparently lean her head against the window and nod off to sleep, and asked if she wasn't concerned that her son was flying her across the mountain range. She said, "There isn't anything I can do about this situation, so I might as well rest. I might as well relax and get a few moments rest." No matter what her state of mind, schedule, or location, Eleanor always managed to complete her column and complete it on time. This is my dad. Dad, I have all these pictures of you as a little boy. This is my dad in the pool. But one of his, and I might skip this story and let you tell it, but my dad tells another story of his summer job one summer when he was about 12 years old in Campobello. Campobello is the location of the Roosevelt summer, or was the location of the Roosevelt summer home, and it's located in the Bay of Fundy off the coast of New Brunswick and is super isolated. You were transported to this little island by ferry, and there were very few cars, if any, on that tiny island. So one of Dad's summer chores that summer was to deliver his grandmother's column to the telegraph office so it could be wired to her publisher the next day, or appear in the paper the next day. And he would do this by bicycle, rain, shine, or fog, as was usually the case. And he said that the piece of paper would arrive at the telegraph office almost illegible sometimes, as he had dropped it in a puddle or retrieved it from a burst of wind. But nevertheless, she managed to get the column written, and Dad managed to get the column delivered, and Dad always felt great personal pride and relief when he would see it appear in the newspaper the following day. So I believe that Eleanor maintained a commitment to writing this column for so long, despite its obvious burdens, because she felt that as long as she was active and involved in public life, it was her obligation to communicate to the American people what she was thinking. She felt deeply that public service and constructive work were an obligation, and once said, "Usefulness, whatever form it may take, is the price we pay for the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the privilege of being alive." For work, Eleanor represented an opportunity to make a contribution, and this is truly where she gained her strength. She was truly engaged in life. So, with a very busy schedule, I can often feel a bit overwhelmed by the incessant onslaught of everyday tasks. But all it takes when this feeling comes creeping into my day is a quick glimpse back into the life of Eleanor Roosevelt. A typical day of Eleanor's usually involved at least one speech or lecture, several meetings, a luncheon, a dinner, and then desk work, which, as I previously mentioned, usually extended way into the morning hours. And although the activities of her day were very different than the activities of my day, I do try to model my attitude after hers. She faced each meeting, each task, and each day as if it was of true interest and the utmost importance. In Eleanor's life, there was never room for complaints or for wishing anything was any different. She wrote in a column in January of 1953, "One of my firmest New Year's resolutions was that I would have hours of leisure in these coming months. But as I look at my calendar for January and February, it seems to have filled up so rapidly that I don't think I'm going to have the leisure hours that I'd counted on. Oh well, perhaps I wouldn't like them even if I had them. So the best New Year's resolution is to be content with whatever comes and to face the world cheerfully." After FDR died and Eleanor was no longer in the White House, Eleanor didn't have to do anything. She had plenty of resources, a huge family, so many friends, an apartment in the city, a comfortable home in the country. But Eleanor was also a woman who had learned that happiness comes from staying engaged in life and making a difference. And although we don't think of Eleanor Roosevelt as a working woman per se, over the course of her lifetime, she pursued an unbelievable number of careers. I don't know if you know, but she authored over 17 books, over 12,000 pages of this daily column. She was an accomplished lecturer. She started a furniture factory in Hyde Park during the Depression, and she started to provide employment during the Depression, and she established an elementary school in New York City. As First Lady, she involved herself in every aspect of domestic legislation. Internationally, Eleanor traveled to every continent except for Antarctica, promoting cultural understanding and compassion. When Eleanor was in her 60s, she was designated a delegate to the United Nations and was the long-standing chair of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And in her 70s, just when most people are really enjoying slowing down, she served as a representative for the American Association for the United Nations. Eleanor saw work as a necessary component to the vitality of the individual, and she continuously underscored work's intrinsic satisfactions and its contributions to the dignity of the self. Eleanor worked and worked hard, but she worked graciously and she worked cheerfully. Adlai Stevenson said at Eleanor's funeral that she would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world. I certainly feel this glow. It lives with me each day. I feel fortunate to feel that I know my great-grandmother so well, and I hope by perhaps keeping the lesson of her life and philosophy alive today, that she may continue to serve as a beacon for all generations. Thank you. So that's a little bit about Eleanor, and now I think Laura will talk about her art.
So it was about 8 years ago. I happened to be visiting in Dallas, but I was up at the ranch, which was where I would like to go when I came in from New York City and Connecticut. And my father called me and said, "Laura, one of your favorite historians is going to be in my office. Would you like to come down and see Ken Burns?" And I said, "I'll be there." So at that point, Ken was in the process of fundraising for his film, The Roosevelts. And he showed us a little bit of a clip about it. And I was it's how I learned my American history. Was listening to the Civil War, to Horatio's Drive, to the Brooklyn Bridge. And I was an artist, an abstract painter. And at that point, I thought, man, oh man, what if I could do something like Ken Burns? Fell very, very short. But what I decided to do was to take historical photographs and combine them with my abstract work. And I call it Historic American Pop. And the idea came to me because I was thinking about pop art in the United States in the 60s and 70s, and I thought of Andy Warhol and the Campbell Soup Can and Jasper Johns and the American flag, and I thought, why can't I do that too with historical images? And so anyway, I got to work, and I started with actually this piece, but I won't go there first. I'm going to go over here to the one right behind my dad. I call that Uncommon Warriors. And that painting is a photograph right after Eleanor and Franklin were married. I became very good friends with Ken, and he asked me to be on his board at one point, and he also then opened up his photographic library to me. So many of the photographs that I have, not only of the Roosevelts, but of my whole collection of historic American pop, have come through Ken's work. It's just much easier because he's already done all the editing for me. So the second painting that I created was this one, and it's called Blue Eyes. And the reason I call it Blue Eyes is because Eleanor is looking at Frank Sinatra. And this photograph was taken in Miami at the Hotel Fontainebleau at the dedication of what became the Boys and Girls Club of America. I took the artistic liberty, as I do with a lot of the photographs, and I cut out Frank Sinatra just because I thought she was so great. I learned from my Aunt Chandler, who this program is dedicated to, that light blue was Eleanor's favorite color, and so and her eyes were actually the color of this painting. The second painting here I call Homage. I loved this stance of FDR. He's so regal, he's so stoic, and he's overlooking the Argentinian fleet here. And I've put it on the background of an American flag. So this one I call Homage. The next painting in the group is the one over here. I'll segue for just a minute and say, at this point, there are about 40 pieces in this collection of historic American pop, and they not only deal with the Roosevelts, but they'll go. I've gone back to Thomas Jefferson and Samuel Adams with the Declaration of, actually the Second Amendment and the separation of church and state. And so each one of my titles comes from some point in history. So I go to that painting that's behind my brother, and I call that one Profiles in Courage. And that painting, Kennedy had gone to Valkill to meet with Eleanor and ask her endorsement for his running for president. And the docents have told me, or somebody told me, and I believe it was a docent or somebody at the library said, that she just crossed her hands in front of him and referred to him and said, "Boy, I don't think you're ready." So she gave him a copy of FDR's speeches, and then they met on the steps of the Senate, and of which this painting was taken, and she asked him, "Have you read everything?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I have." And he opened up the book, and it was highlighted, and he said, "Well, now we have something to talk about." So that painting over there I call Profiles in Courage. It was done, just a little bit about the artistic process. I chose this painting of mine, and it's called Yusuyuki. And Yusuyuki is a Japanese word, a Japanese type of painting. And Jasper Johns employed that a lot, of its cross-hatching. And so I chose the Yusuyuki painting. I made my own Yusuyuki, and it's with your hands. It's a lot of finger painting. And so I put those those together because of Eleanor and JFK's hands are right there. So I just thought it was a fun way. Being an artist, you get to have a lot of fun. The other painting behind my sister, I call Through the Looking Glass. It was taken right outside of the Oval Office. It was in the throes of the Vietnam War, and LBJ is just mesmerized, gazing at FDR, and I just thought he was saying, if you could give me your wisdom, if you could look through to me to help me at this point in time with what we were facing as the Americans in Vietnam. So, and I also took a lot of artistic liberty with that photograph. I actually turned it all around and upside down and put the light under FDR. So that's what you get to do when you're an artist. You get to be really creative with different things. Finally, as this program is dedicated to my Aunt Chandler, the Historical Society of Dallas asked me about 8 months ago if they could exhibit some of this work, this collection. And I was very honored and very humbled that they would want to do that. And I thought, well, how could I make it a little more interesting? And so I wrote a proposal, and I presented it to my Aunt Chandler and to Liz, and thought it would be wonderful to have quotes of Eleanor and Franklin to go along with each one of these paintings. Well, Chandler passed away before, after Chandler's passing, she had told me that there were a few pieces that she wanted to include in this exhibition. One is this one right back here, and it shows my dad, his mother, Chandler, FDR and Eleanor visiting at their family ranch in Benbrook, Texas. Then the other photograph that Chandler wanted me to use was of Eleanor late at night, as Liz referenced, at her desk writing her column, My Day. And I did find that, and I am going to use it in the exhibition coming up in 2019. And I invite you all to come there and to see the full collection that goes from Adams and Jefferson all the way through, really through LBJ. That's as far as I've gotten, covering most of all the different presidents. So thank you. And come and take a look at the art a little bit closer, if you'd like.
In my mind, FDR's greatest accomplishments were a combination of his persuasiveness, his ability to persuade people to his point of view, not only the common man, the citizenry, but also members of Congress, that he was able to put through so much formative and really very unusual for its day legislative stuff. And the other real talent that I think that he had, which exhibited itself principally, I think, during the war years, was his ability to recognize talent. He didn't think that he was necessarily the wisest man in the room, but he was able to discern who was perhaps the wisest man in the room for a given task. And I think it was that combination of being able to recognize talent, gather it around him, and his ability to then, when he had something that he wanted to accomplish, persuade people that was the right path. FDR is perhaps unique in his persistence because of his having to overcome the disabilities that he overcame in order to continue to pursue his goal in life. And I think that was perhaps unique in our history. But I don't think his desire and his resilience and his determination is necessarily unique in our history. But his circumstances were certainly unique.
How do we happen to be here in Texas? Well, it all began, my mother is a Fort Worth girl. She was born in Fort Worth in 1910. Her father worked for Mr. Swift in Chicago as a cattle buyer in the, of course, Swift and Company was in the meat packing business in Chicago. And Mr. Swift sent my maternal grandfather to Fort Worth, really at the dawn of the 20th century in 1902, to build packing plants in Texas. So my mother was a native Texan. My father, as a very young man, was always interested in aviation, which was an emerging, brand new field, but he had an abiding interest from the time he was a youngster. And believe it or not, at age 22, was the aviation editor for the Hearst newspapers. And Mr. Hearst sent him to Texas in 1932 to interview a man who had started a fledgling little airline called American Airways. His name was C.R. Smith. And so my dad came to Fort Worth and Dallas, and in the process of being here, met my mother, and they fell in love, and they were married. My sister Chandler came along. Well, they lived, shortly after they were married, they bought some property west of Fort Worth near Benbrook, Texas, and they called it, my father named it the Dutch Branch Ranch. And of course, the Roosevelt family is of Dutch origin, so he thought that was a cute little moniker. Chandler was born in 1934. I was born in 1936. We have a younger brother who was born in 1942. And we lived on the ranch from the time we were born until our parents were divorced in 1944 in the midst of the war. We lived there on the ranch, which was 18 miles at that time from Fort Worth. It's almost in town now. And we were, from the time we were born, we were surrounded every moment of our existence with Secret Service. Our home on the ranch, there was a detached garage, which was a two-story affair, a garage down below and an apartment above. The apartment above was dedicated as a place where the Secret Service men could stay when they were on duty. I loved having these Secret Service men around. I was a young boy. These were fellows who were in their late 20s and 30s, and they each had some reason why they were not in the military, some physical reason. But taking care, being babysitters for these two young children was boring at best, I'm sure. I loved it because they were great companions and playmates for me. And in their boredom, we did a lot of different things. They would make things for me. We'd go down to the creek and they'd pull their pistols out and shoot across the creek at rocks and stuff and all of that sort of thing. We did all sorts of things. My sister and I, one of our favorite pastimes was trying to give the Secret Service the slip. And occasionally we were successful, and we would run off and we'd hide someplace in a pasture, either in a ditch or behind, or we'd climb a tree or something. And when they couldn't find us, all pandemonium would break loose. There were cowboys on horseback. There were Secret Service men in cars. They were just going all over the place trying to find us. And eventually they'd either find us or we'd come out, and then it was real hell to pay for us. But at any rate, my father is Elliott. He's the second of FDR's boys. I'm Elliott Jr., but I've always been called Tony. And when I was, I think, 8 or 9, I asked my mother, how did I get the name Tony? She said, I haven't got the slightest idea. So at any rate, we lived out there, and one of the pictures up here of my father behind the microphone, and you might have seen on the microphone it said TSN. After he and mother were married, they stayed in Fort Worth, and he got in the radio broadcasting business, and he with some backing of men in Fort Worth, bought 5 different radio stations in Texas. The key station was KFJZ in Fort Worth, and those 5 stations he put together were called the Texas State Network. And he used to give he used to broadcast the 5 o'clock news every evening. He was very much aware of the imminency of hostilities, and well before we entered the war, he was the first of FDR's boys to join the military. He joined the Army Air Corps on his 30th birthday in 1940, and from the beginning of his career during World War II, he was involved with aerial reconnaissance, and was really on the forefront of the development of that technique both the developing technology around aerial photography and particularly night photography. So his initial assignment was to find with another group, of course, was to find a ferry point for aircraft being transported from the United States to Great Britain. And they felt that the existing air facility at Gander was not appropriate because it was too easy for the Germans to shell from the sea. So they found a more remote spot, and they built an air facility, an air base called Goose Bay, which ended up being the primary transport facility for aircraft during World War II. After, and it's off the coast of Newfoundland. After he did that, then he became involved with the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch it was called, and they were fully engaged there. They initially were flying the P-38, called the Lockheed Lightning, and it had no armament. They stripped it down of no armament, had no protective armament either, no guns or no protective armament, but still was no match in either speed or maneuverability for the German planes that were up against them. And so they ended up using another aircraft, which was actually a British built aircraft called the Mosquito fighter bomber. And it was faster and more agile, and that was used throughout the balance of the war by the reconnaissance flyers. And after Africa, and then of course there was the invasion of Sicily, and then Italy, and then the entire wing moved up to England and began to do reconnaissance over Europe in preparation for the Normandy invasion. My father went into the service as a captain. He was commissioned as a captain when he joined up in 1930, and there was a huge hue and cry in the country by a lot of people who said, well, I want to be a captain too. And at any rate, he was commissioned as a captain, but he really had a stellar military career, and I think probably, in my own view, probably should have stayed in the military instead of getting out in 1945 at the end of the war. I think that the military was actually his greatest calling in his life. But at any rate, he did, on his own merit, achieve the rank of brigadier general. When he mustered out in 1945, he was a brigadier general. After that, he and my mother, as I said, were divorced in 1944 when he was still overseas, and all during the war there was gas rationing. My sister and I went to public schools in Fort Worth. The Secret Service were exempt from gas rationing, so they had plenty of gas to get us back and forth to school every day. And my mother, on the other hand, didn't have enough tickets to get into town very often, and she became frustrated with that. And so in 1944, after she and my father were divorced, she sold the ranch, and we moved into town. My father did a number of things after. Well, when he came back, he settled at Hyde Park. Hyde Park itself was actually an operating farm of about 1,600 acres. They had a dairy herd of about 40 cows. They raised grain on a commercial basis. They also had an extensive Christmas tree growing operation and sold Christmas trees in New York City every year. He bought the estate, right after FDR died. The main residence, called Springwood, and 40 acres around it was given to the government, and that's also where the FDR Library is located, and it's a National Historic Site to this day. But the balance of the property, the operating farm my father purchased, FDR had, Grandmere, we called her, she had built, Liz alluded to the fact that she had started during the Depression era a furniture manufacturing facility on the estate at Hyde Park, and it was at a place they called Kill, which was a pond with a stream flowed through. And that's, she actually, after the Depression era, she converted that into a residence for herself. And that's where she would retire to frequently, even during their marriage. FDR also built a sort of a retreat of his own on the estate further back to the east on a high point of ground. It was called Top Cottage. And after my father bought the farm, that's where he resided. And that was in 1945. My sister and I began going to Hyde Park in the summertime, and we would spend almost the entire summer at Hyde Park. And our grandmother was there most of the time, and we would have almost, not breakfast every day, but almost every day we would have lunch and dinner with her whenever she was there. And of course there was generally other visitors present, some of them really very important people, and irrespective of who it might be, we were all of us young children were always at the table with whoever it might happen to be there. It was all very, very quite informal. My father actually, while the farm continued to operate, he was at that point he entered the advertising business in New York, and he commuted into the city every day, and would come back at the end of the day. And we would always gather in Melvina Thompson's apartment. She was Grandmere's secretary, and she had her own apartment at Kill, and we would all gather there around 5 o'clock, and then we'd all have dinner together. That continued. We continued to stay at Hyde Park for 6 summers, 1945 through the summer of 1950, at which point my father left Hyde Park. He sold the farm to his youngest brother, John, and John's family moved in, and my father began ranching in Colorado. And so, there was a picture up here earlier. I went to college in Colorado, and that picture of Grandmere getting out of an airplane with the guy in the uniform, that was me. I was an ROTC cadet and was commissioned upon graduation and went into the Army at that time. So anyway, my father had a number of different vocations during the balance of his life. Toward the end of his life, you may be aware that he became an author of mysteries, and he wrote 22 separate little short mystery books. And Grandmere was featured in most of them as the kind of the Sherlock Holmes, the one who solved the murder or solved whatever the issue was. So at any rate, that's, my sister and my younger brother and I were all born, raised in Texas. We're here to this day. And at that point, that's kind of how we got here, why we're here. JoAnne and I, my wife who's here today, we've lived in Denver, Colorado, and New York for extended periods of time, but we came back to Dallas in 1970, and we've been here ever since.
I didn't appreciate when I was a boy really the inner strength of FDR and what it took him to lead this country through the Great Depression and through World War II. And really as a person who had recovered from polio, I don't think any of us have any concept of what it would be like to have your mobility taken away from you. And to do what he did with that sort of disability, I think is remarkable.
Eleanor had such a great sense of empathy with her fellow man, no matter what their color was, no matter what their situation was, which in a sense was countercultural, and I think even today is somewhat countercultural. And I think that led her to do things like forming Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations. But just, again, just facing the demons when you look back at her upbringing, not having a mother and father who lifted her up, who instilled confidence, self-esteem, and yet she herself mustered that up. And I find that to be pretty amazing.
I'd like for you to just tell some of these, I'd like for you to discuss a little bit, like this one right here.
Was on the occasion of FDR's visit to Texas in 1941. I'm sorry, he came down, and at that time he traveled to Mexico, and this is a function that was of ceremony that was had in Mexico. That's the president of Mexico, Camacho. Well, that's my christening at the White House in 1937. That's my sister on Eleanor's lap. And that's FDR and Eleanor and all of their 5 children.
Which one is that? What's the name?
This is on the occasion of the Atlantic Charter, which was the first conference between Churchill and Roosevelt, where they were really kind of setting forth what their vision of what the world should look like after the war. Oh, that's a picture at our ranch, Dutch Branch Ranch. That's my sister and I with Grandmere.
Isn't that a wonderful photo? Yep. You rarely see pictures of Eleanor so personal.
And that's another picture at the ranch. My dad's driving. That's his older brother Jimmy in the back seat. That's my mother on the left, and that's FDR with Dad.
This is your dad?
I'll tell you a cute story. When Eleanor passed away in 1962, following her funeral at St. James Church, there was a lunch back at Valkill, her home. In Valkill, at one of the buildings there is called the Stone Cottage, and it's quite small. And there was a huge throng of people. And they were serving lunch, and it was very crowded. There were 3 living presidents present at that lunch. And being as crowded as it was, and there were several of us grandchildren there helping to serve and clean up and do different things. Crowded as it was, somebody said, why don't the presidents get out of this crowd and just go into one of the bedrooms and sit down where they can have a little space? And it was interesting. I don't know which one was the first. There was Truman and Kennedy and Eisenhower who were there. And whoever the first one was, as the next one would come in, they would each greet the new person as Mr. President. They didn't call each other by their first names. They called each other Mr. President.
Tell them about what Kennedy asked you to do.
I'm sorry?
Tell
Yeah. Well, John, the youngest of the boys, was the only Republican in the family. And Kennedy, who was the president, and Eisenhower was there. Kennedy was then president. And he asked John, because John and Dwight were good acquaintances. And so Kennedy went over to John and said, John, would you just keep Dwight occupied? I don't want him telling me how to run things. That's my father on the occasion of his being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. And who, Toby, was it General Doolittle who awarded him that, or pinned the award on him? And this was a visit of FDR to Texas in 1937. He came down on a destroyer, which was parked right off of Galveston. And on the occasion of that visit, he loved to fish. And so somebody said, how'd you like to go tarpon fishing? And so there he is, tarpon fishing. That's him, and that's my father in the back of the boat with him. And on the occasion of that visit, he visited both Clint Murkison, who owned a part of Mustang Island, which is one of the barrier islands off the Texas coast, and Sid Richardson owned St. Joseph Island, St. Joe, and so he was hosted by those two gentlemen on those two islands while he was in the Gulf. That's in 1941 when FDR was down, and they were just visiting what was then called the Consolidated Vultee Aircraft Plant. It was called the Bomber Plant, adjacent. It's where Lockheed Martin makes the F-35 today. It was then called the Bomber Plant next to Carswell Air Force Base.
Can you tell us about one of your Christmases that in 1944 you spent with FDR and Eleanor?
Yeah. Well, we resided in Texas, and we on occasion went back east to either the White House or Hyde Park for different occasions, either at Christmas time, sometimes Thanksgiving. And it was before the advent of commercial airline travel, so it was always by train. And so, speaking of the Secret Service and whatnot, I think the only reason we had Secret Service protection, I think, was because of the perceived threat of kidnapping. And I don't think there was ever any real threat that involved us children, except on the occasion of one trip back east. There was apparently, we were unaware of it, but after the fact we became aware that there apparently was a serious kidnap concern. So, but anyway, that's, they were always around. And it's interesting when you go places and President Bush or Mrs. Bush or places around Dallas, many times you're not aware of the Secret Service presence, but they are always right there, close by.
Do you remember a Christmas at the White House?
Yes, but Tom, while we got to know our grandmother, Grandmere, very, very well through all of our summers that we spent at Hyde Park, I was only 8 years old when FDR died, and when we were back at the White House or at Hyde Park, we would be with FDR generally at dinner time. He was, needless to say, pretty occupied and busy, and so we saw very little of him. But we see our grandmother all the time. As Liz alluded to, neither one of them were very attentive parents. She became a very attentive grandmother, but she was making up for perhaps lost time as a mother.
I wanted to mention Toby, inspired by his father's military service and his grandfather's military service. He was a fighter pilot. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think you pretty much said it. As a young boy, it really started with my step-grandfather, who was in the same fighter squadron or reconnaissance squadron flying fighters in North Africa with my grandfather. He was under his command, in fact, talking about his activities, none of the details of which I recall, but it made an impression upon me. And based upon my father having served in the U.S. Army as in the infantry, I thought in some capacity I'd like to serve. And so I was in Army ROTC in college, and then I was a private pilot, and I learned about a really neat Air Force program. And then so I competed for a slot at the 457th Tactical Fighter Squadron at Carswell Air Force Base, and was very fortunate to win that slot. And they sent me to 6 schools, and then I came out fighter pilot, and then went through mission qualification training, and then was on duty with them, and had a marvelous, marvelous experience.
Thank you for your service.
Since I wasn't at your meeting at Dad's office, I thought I'd relay a funny story. When I was going through my Aunt Chandler's photographs and her archives, basically, after she passed away, creating her memorial, I ran across my grandmother's diary entry about when the King and Queen came to Valkill. And I think I've relayed this to Dad and maybe to Mom, but I don't know, Liz, if you've heard it, or Toby, if you've heard it. So I was reading her account, and she said that they brought in servants to help serve the King and Queen from the White House. And they were not used to such a small kitchen. So they also brought in all the Limoges china that the President of France had given to FDR and Eleanor, and it was stacked up outside of the kitchen getting ready to serve. And all of a sudden, they heard this huge crash, and it all came tumbling down, according to my grandmother. And the other thing, which I thought was really, my grandmother was very petite like my sister, and she remarked, well, I'm smaller than the Queen. And she also said that as they were being served, I think it was mint juleps or something, the staff came out, and my grandfather and grandmother were standing there, and they took their drink, and all of a sudden the staff came back and said, no, you've got to put it back. We have to serve the King and the Queen first. So there are a few little stories that I don't think anybody knew until reading my grandmother's diary.
Toby alluded to it. After my mother and father were divorced, then my mother's second marriage was to Harry Edson. He and my father were in the same unit all through North Africa, and then Sicily and Italy and up into England. My mother, there were a lot of, not a lot, but there were quite a few injuries associated with their activities. And whenever an injured flyer or navigator from one of those units was repatriated back to the country, to this country, they were sent to the hospital in San Antonio. And my mother would always or occasionally take me in tow with her, and she would go down to San Antonio. We'd stay at the St. Anthony Hotel, and she would go visit these injured pilots or navigators or whatever their stature was. And one of those was ended up being my stepfather. Harry Edson had been piloting with 2 other planes, piloting a Mosquito fighter bomber back from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to North Africa, and it was either in the Azores or the Cape Verde Islands, or anyway, he felt that his airplane had been, he had engine failure on both engines almost simultaneously, and he felt after the fact that it was a case of espionage or sabotage. anyway, he almost made it to the landing strip, but not quite. Landed, he hit the beach, short of the runway, went right through the bottom of the airplane, and was really banged up. And so he ended up being at the hospital in San Antonio, and that's where he and my mother met, and they ended up getting married eventually.
Yes, Mr. Roosevelt. Christine Wicker wrote a book on your grandfather, Simple Faith, Franklin Roosevelt, and she attributed a lot of his actions to his Episcopal faith and his belief that he had a duty to help people, kind of like your great-great-uncle did too. But, you know, of course, we don't see very much of this today, and it's kind of sad. That's the only thing I thought I would say. And but was it his? Do you think he was a very religious man? Do you think? Or?
I think so. I think his faith was a real pillar of his existence. I think he, as a child, had grown up in the Episcopal Church. St. James was the church there at Hyde Park, and he had been a member of that vestry later on, and his father had been a stalwart part of the St. James community before he came along, and throughout his life, his funeral was at the St. James Episcopal Church in Hyde Park, and yes, I think that he was deeply devoted to his faith.
I'm the epitome of the person that you don't ever want to sit next to. So my husband and I were sitting in the dentist's office, and we struck up a conversation with the man in the waiting room. And my husband left, and I continued talking with the man. And I said, "Oh, tell me your name." He said, "Tony Roosevelt." Oh. So he comes out, and the first thing I say is, "Chandler?" And he says, "That's my sister." Well, I'm a member of the United Nations Association here in the Dallas chapter, and I was able to share with Tony, as he says, that his grandmother came to Dallas in 1953 and met with Judge Sarah T. Hughes and Vivian Castleberry, and they started the Dallas chapter of the United Nations Association. And it's still, today, we're a very vibrant part of the United Nations Association. We're the only organization that supports the UN through education and information. And I'm so excited to connect with you all and wanted to tell you what a wonderful heritage your grandmother has to the city of Dallas.
Thank you.
For our younger audience, tell them who Sarah T. Hughes was.
Oh, Judge Sarah T. Hughes is the one who gave the oath of office to the president, to Lyndon Baines Johnson, after the Kennedy assassination.
We made our first visit this summer to the little White House at Warm Springs this summer, and we're amazed at how simple the accommodations were at the little White House, and I imagine it hasn't changed too much since then, but were you ever lucky enough to pay a visit to Warm Springs when
Yes.
the president was there?
Yeah, a lot of a good part of my time in the Army was spent at Fort Benning in Georgia, so JoAnne and I went over to Warm Springs on several different occasions, and weren't you struck by the simplicity of the bedroom where he died? That was just a tiny little single bed in a very, very simple setting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? There you go.
I was born in 1946, and I didn't have a lot of female role models. And I think watching Eleanor Roosevelt, even from a distance, helped me to formulate that I could have some power as a female. And I don't know if you could understand, growing up in those days, I was taught that a female couldn't own property in her own name, and I had ambitions to travel. And when I saw an ad for the Air Force in 1962, I said, that's what I want to do. And when my parents didn't say a word for 2 years, I graduated, went down to the recruiter's office, came back with the papers, because as a female, they both had to sign. They both said no. They had never said a word for 2 years. 6 months later, they were very willing to sign.
Yeah.
But your grandmother gave me a model of a female who could not be locked into a traditional mold that enabled me to do this. I sent a letter to President Eisenhower when I was 8 years old, and he responded. He thought it was an adult writing to him. I wanted to give him some information I thought he didn't have.
That's marvelous. Thank you for sharing that.
Questions, comments, protest? Okay.
Tom, I'd like to introduce one other person who's
Yes,
here.
sir.
There's a lady sitting there, Barbara Shannon. She has been working with me
Barbara Stan.
for 30 years and knows more about what goes on in my life than a lot of people. Yeah, I do. Yeah, my son-in-law Seth Kelley, Liz's husband, and Christina Kelley, and Ben Kelley.
So last year we learned about the Cold War and as it news politics during the 40s, and we got to learn about the. It's got to learn about FDR's. It's got to learn about FDR's administration and a little bit about Truman's. And typically, when we talk about U.S. history, it's always seemed to have a positive view of FDR, except for the internment of Japanese citizens. So I was wondering. So I was wondering if y'all knew what reason he gave for the return of Japanese citizens, and what Eleanor thought about it.
You know, I think in retrospect, that whole action was probably ill-conceived. In retrospect, it was a poor idea to incarcerate people without any due process whatsoever. Under our existing judicial system. I'm sure Eleanor probably heartily objected to it at the time, but you know, I think that there were a lot of things that FDR felt were necessary under the circumstances that she was not in favor of, but you know, that he felt were necessary.
People were really afraid of Japanese. I was born in 1929. I'm probably the oldest person here, so I remember a whole lot of things some of you wouldn't. I remember when I was a little girl in Houston, of course, we had black women where, you know, our maids were black, and I remember when all the black women got together and they formed the Eleanor Club, and that's what they called it, was the Eleanor Club. And I don't know what the financial figures were, probably $4 a day they were getting in those days, which bought a lot more than it does today, but it still wasn't much. And they all decided they're not going to work for less than whatever it was. But that's, I think, the first memory I have of the Eleanor Club, of really Eleanor Roosevelt. But I do remember the day FDR died, and I was downtown and cried. That's the only president I ever knew. I mean, the world came to an end if FDR died. We just couldn't figure how America's going to go on without him. And another friend of mine, one more thing, we were big fans of Eleanor, and when she spoke in Dallas, I went to hear her. And right now on my little bulletin board in my kitchen, I have a little figure of Eleanor that I got when I was at Hyde Park in Valkill, and then my daughter lives in New York, and we went up there to see everything. I mean, we're just big fans. And somebody came in one time and said, "Is that a picture of you?" I said, "No, that's not me." Well, he didn't know who it was. I said, "That's Eleanor Roosevelt," so I had to tell him who that was. But I've been, as far as I can remember, an adult, a big fan of Eleanor Roosevelt. And one of my best friends, anything related to Eleanor, we always related to each other, but she's unfortunately died. She would love to have been here and heard this. And I would have enjoyed it only more if she would have been with me. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. One interesting note, you mentioned when on the incidents of FDR's passing. He died on April 12th, 1945. And, you know, I said earlier that the Secret Service were a pervasive presence in our lives. The day that FDR died, they left. They were gone. We never saw them again.
Great. Thank y'all for coming.